The Queen Anne Historical Society is very excited to present to you tonight this presentation by architectural historian Marvin Anderson on the life and work of Walter Willcox, the man behind the walls. So I will hand this over to Marvin to introduce himself and get started. Thank you, Marvin.
Thank you, Maureen, for that introduction, and thank you all for joining this. As Maureen said, my name is Marvin Anderson. I'm an architect and architectural historian in Seattle. For those who live on Queen Anne Hill, indeed for many throughout Seattle, the walls that support Queen Anne Boulevard along 7th and 8th Avenues West are very special. Throughout all seasons, walkers enjoy the boulevard and from atop the walls gaze out across Puget Sound. The stairs provide access to the streets below and also convenient places for exercise, even a location for wedding photographs. But it's not only the view or the exercise that we enjoy. We often pause to admire the walls, the stairs, and the lampposts themselves. When you stop and think for a moment, it's pretty remarkable that these century-old walls, this piece of urban infrastructure, continues to be so admired and appreciated. It's even more remarkable that we've taken to calling them the Willcox walls, that we've attached to them the name of the man who designed them. So who was this Willcox, the man behind the walls? He is or was Walter Rossbaum's Willcox, an architect who lived in Seattle between 1908 and 1922. Tonight, I'm going to show you some of Walter Willcox's other work, but I'm mostly going to talk about Walter, the individual, and about his ideas and his philosophy of architecture. And I'm going to try to untangle the principles behind his design thinking, seeking to understand why the walls are still so admired. In doing so, I'm going to draw from over 200 family letters and photographs that have recently been shared with me by Norman Willcox, his great-nephew. As we'll see, Walter Willcox was a complex individual and much more than just an architect. Walter Rossbaum Willcox was born in Burlington, Vermont on August 2, 1869, where his father, Monson Alva Willcox, was a Baptist minister. Walter was the second son, and it was his older brother Arthur with whom he carried on a lifelong correspondence. Walter and Arthur had two younger brothers and two younger sisters, but only one brother, Frank, and one sister, Helen, lived to adulthood. Their mother, Sarah, was very important in all of their lives, and in later years often passed news among her children. We'll hear as well from some of her letters. After growing up in Burlington, Walter attended Colgate Academy in Hamilton, New York, and then spent 2 years at Kalamazoo College in Michigan, where his father was president. Leaving Kalamazoo in 1890, he moved to Chicago, a bustling city with much to offer, an ambitious 20-year-old. There he lived with his aunt and uncle, Emma and William Mason, and his 3 cousins while he got on his feet. In Chicago, Walter first worked for his uncle William at Electric Merchandise Company, supplier of equipment and electric heaters for street railways. There he was a writer, preparing articles, press releases, and copy for the company, most of which were published under his uncle's name. He also began writing regular letters to his brother Arthur, who had moved to London, where he was editor of the periodical Tramway and Railway World. 1 year after arriving, he wrote Arthur, "I'm writing a good deal lately, and the more I do, the easier I do it. I may find my place in journalism." By the spring of 1892, Walter had moved to the monthly trade publication Electrical Industries, where he began selling ads and subscriptions. Working out of the company's office in the brand new Monadnock building, he called on people throughout the city, walking the streets of Chicago's growing business district. That May, he wrote Arthur that he was doing better in business than expected. "I'm working hard and I'm quite contented. I have been well treated and enjoy being outdoors. It is improving my health. I live more regularly and enjoy life more than I did the preceding year." But by August, his mood had changed. "I cannot continue any number of years as an advertising man," he wrote Arthur. As a class, they are disliked on general principles. I am purely a mercenary employee, but I'm not blue or discouraged. I'm quite happy. As his work took him daily across the city, Walter paid attention to its buildings. In September 1892, he wrote Arthur, "I have the restless feeling within me to create something, anything which can benefit mankind. I have never expected to gain wealth. I don't care for it. I would like a good, generous living in middle life and hope to have it." He told Arthur that where 5 years earlier he thought his future was in music, now he felt it was in architecture. "Outside of a musical composition produced from my head and performed," he wrote, "I don't know anything that can thrill me so as to think of a building growing from my plans, the very fruit of my mind, the embodiment of my ideas of beauty and usefulness. So forcibly has this come to me in the last 5 weeks that I have gotten out my drawing tools, laid away nearly a year and a half, and I have been working, copying, to increase my facility in the mere handling of them. I have studied plans and the rules of perspective, and the more I work, the more I am engrossed. Up to that time, I had intentionally not read anything along the line, and I reasoned that I was too old to take it up and had better drop it entirely and forget it. But at last I thought it over carefully, and I began to think differently. Knowing my wavering temperament, which I've always been told I possessed, I have not done anything rash. I thought that this fever might pass over, so I'm going to wait for a few months yet before I actively look for a change or a chance to begin in earnest. Do you think I ought to give up the idea or go into it for pay? Let me hear your views soon." Well, contrary to what he wrote, Walter was rash, and by the end of that month he had left Chicago to study architecture in the East. But before leaving, he visited the World's Columbian Exposition, then nearing the end of construction. He admired the grand symmetrical Court of Honor, and he paid attention to the transportation building designed by Louis Sullivan, who he had met at some point in the previous 2 years. The grandeur of the fair symmetrical court, Sullivan's iconoclastic building, and Sullivan's philosophy of architecture were all to leave lifelong impressions. By October 1892, Walter was living in Boston, where he sought entry to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He got a job with architect William Peters, writing his mother Sarah that on his first day there he made a tracing of the side elevation of a hospital when his co-workers complimented. "I cannot express the contentment I feel," he wrote. "I have that certain conviction that this is my work, which I never felt before." And on the upper left is a picture of the hospital Walter worked on that very first day. Walter had moved to Boston, hoping to be accepted in MIT's architecture program. 23 years old and with several years of college behind him, he did not want to enter as a freshman, but sought entry as a special student. But he was turned away and told that if he studied freehand drawing, shades and shadows, the orders of architecture, and architectural history, he might be granted admission the following autumn. Walter worked for Peters for a year while studying feverishly. He wrote Arthur, quote, "My old life has ended, thank heavens for it, and I have begun anew. I certainly never applied myself to anything yet as I am now to my work. Branches of the work that I frankly admitted I would not relish are becoming interesting. But in a small way, I can say the artistic side appeals more than the constructive. I find my work is awakening my nature to the beautiful things around me, which I did not seem to notice before, not only in regard to buildings, but in life and nature itself. I am at the bottom of the ladder, but there's lots of room aloft, and I'm going to get just as high as my get-up will allow. I have not good reason for thinking so, but I have a conceited sort of feeling that someday I will poke my head into the group above the majority line. I am no genius, but won't I have done good if I do nothing bad? These aspirations are all new to me. I never hoped for anything before." The following year, the fall of 1893, Walter found he had been misled by MIT, and he began to look at other schools. He wrote Arthur in closing this sketch, "Now I know immediately that my taste is for design. I abhor the practical side of life's work. Therefore, I want to learn designing. So I want a course that can give me instruction in that one thing. He applied to the University of Pennsylvania, and with a strong letter of recommendation from William Peters, he was accepted. In September 1893, Walter entered Penn's architecture program as a special student. On the right is his fall class schedule. And there, one of his favorite critics was Wilson Eyre, designer of many country houses. Few letters were sent by Walter that year, but in December he wrote his mother, Sarah, "Professor Laird showed me my record of work done so far. He is the principal of the department, and I have secured the best they give in everything. They call the rankings good, fair, and poor, and I received all goods." Despite his high marks, Walter was impatient and stayed at Penn for only 1 year. By the following July, he had moved to Burlington, Vermont, settled in with another aunt and uncle, and opened an architectural office. Well remembered for his family ties, he began to get his first architectural work. He wrote Arthur, "I suppose by now you know of my latest venture. There is a considerable degree of rashness in it, but circumstances seem to point to it being the only prospect of any sort. If some of my good friends here knew that 2 years ago this month I did not know how to use an architectural scale, they would have more hesitation relying on my experience and taste. But I know I have accomplished about 4 years of work and experience in these two. I have known just what I wanted, and I have gotten as much of that as time and health have allowed. At any rate, I don't tell people that 2 years is the extent of my acquaintance with the profession." Walter lived and worked in Burlington for 12 years, where he designed 80 gardens, interiors, and buildings, many of them houses. This house for Frank Boynton was among his first large houses, designed beginning in 1896 and completed in 1898. He was so proud of it that he mailed Arthur mounted photographs. Just months after arriving in Burlington, Walter wrote his brother, "I like my work better than ever. I'm learning many an important thing every day and have just the nerve to tackle any job I can get." But getting established was difficult, especially during the economic downturn of the mid-1890s, and he frequently found himself competing with entrenched practices. Burlington people have in the past depended so much on carpenters and builders, he wrote, that they seem to think it superfluous to hire an architect and will not pay the ordinary percentage. Ever eager to learn more, Walter looked intently at the buildings around him, read widely, avidly followed the architectural periodicals, and begged Arthur to send him books, pictures, and magazines from England. In a long letter of January 1895, he wrote disdainfully of the growing fashion for classical architecture and of his admiration for H.H. Richardson, who he felt was being unjustly criticized. "How can anything be fundamentally wrong, which is absolutely practicable, which completely fits the bill, and which by all the principles of art in the abstract is beautiful? Look, for instance, at the Billings. There never has been found a want not met satisfactorily in it. Take it artistically, inside and out. Plan an elevation, front and rear. Look at its lines, look at its masses, look at the front. Is it not satisfying? Would you change the position of the main gable a foot either way, raise it or lower it a foot? Or the tower or the wings, would you change the shape, a pitch of the roofs, or anything? Well, of course, Richardson fell short at times, but to me, almost any one of his buildings contains more of interest than whole streets in Paris, because the man himself is in each one. I wish architects would cease to see this or that school in a man's work and look for the beautiful in line and mass and proportion and utility, for absolute utility may approach the beautiful." Here, already at age 26, we see Walter advocating qualities of architecture over particular schools or styles, and admiring simplicity and utility, beliefs that would influence his work on the Queen Anne walls 20 years later. In the fall of 1896, Walter returned to Chicago on vacation. While there, he renewed his friendship with Evelyn Porter, with whom he had worked at Electrical Industries, and the two became engaged to marry. Walter wrote Arthur that he enjoyed studying Chicago's new architecture, adding, "When in Chicago, I called upon and spent an hour with Mr. Louis Sullivan, architect of the Auditorium and Schiller Theaters and the Transportation Building at the fair. He is unique in American architecture, occupying a key position similar to that of Richardson. He is a genius. I had a most interesting visit with him, and he gave me 2 orthographic sketches, which I have framed and hung in my office." Walter returned to Burlington, busier than ever, and on the 3rd anniversary of opening his office, wrote Arthur, "There is a joy in the conception of a beautiful form, however unimportant its place." He continued to seek forms of expression that did not completely turn away from precedent, but at the same time were not copies of past architecture. After describing his design for the high school in a letter to Arthur, he added, "One building possessed of the strength which Richardson or John Root got into theirs is worth more in spite of their crudities sometimes than 100 of the classical resurrections where so-called refinement has sapped the life away." In October of 1899, Walter Willcox and Evelyn Porter were married in her hometown of Freeport, Illinois. He was 30 and she was 29. After a brief honeymoon, they returned to Burlington to live. It was a celebratory time, for Arthur, his wife Amy, and their newborn had come to the U.S. to visit. And here you see a family picture. Walter Willcox is in the upper right, above his mother, who's seated in the chair. Evelyn Porter is sitting on the floor in the lower left. Arthur, to whom he wrote so many letters, is standing in the background and has a mustache. Soon after his return to Burlington, Walter designed a brick home where he, Evelyn, and Eva's sister Edna lived. He entered several competitions, and in May 1902 was selected as architect for the new Burlington Carnegie Library. He also began to give talks on architecture. In February 1902, he told the Outlook Club that, quote, "Intelligent creation and judgment of architecture must be based not only upon the buildings of earlier times, but upon a clear understanding of the special needs of the particular building. Knowledge supplies the materials, and understanding guides the selection of forms which honestly express the functions of a building." To result in a beautiful building, forms must answer honestly some actual requirement, because the final test of beauty is truth, and the combination of knowledge and understanding is essential to the expression and the recognition of truth. Walter's practice continued to be busy with ever larger buildings, but his letters to Arthur reveal less and less enthusiasm for the work. In February 1903, he wrote, "The wheels go round with little variation in speed or friction." He continued to follow architectural trends, and in 1903 began corresponding with Charles White, a young draftsman who had worked briefly in Burlington before moving to Oak Park, Illinois, to work for Frank Lloyd Wright. Much has been written about a possible early friendship between Willcox and Frank Lloyd Wright, but Charles White's letters reveal something different, that long before Frank Lloyd Wright knew Walter, he knew Evelyn through her brother, for whom Wright worked while studying at the University of Wisconsin. In the summer of 1904, Walter and Evelyn visited the St. Louis Fair and then Chicago, where Charles White showed them some of Frank Lloyd Wright's newer buildings. Later, Charles wrote Walter, "Upon my mentioning your appreciation of his work, Mr. Wright signed and gave me the enclosed portrait today, with the request that I send it to you. He said, 'If Willcox is half as good a feller as his wife, he is all right.'" By the fall of 1906, letters from Sarah to Arthur spoke of Evelyn's unhappiness living in the East and Walter's increasing desire to leave Burlington. He was depressed in his work and saw less and less public spirit each year. "Walter said one night," wrote their mother, "I wonder if I shall lose all enthusiasm in my work, all inspiration, if I stay here. I hate to leave my home, but I ask myself, is it best because I am happy here to remain and stagnate?" Sarah told Arthur that during the recent trip to Chicago, quote, "Walter saw several prominent men, some he had met before, others he had known by reputation for a long time. Three different men said, "Go to Seattle." And to Seattle Walter went, arriving by train in the early evening of November 21, 1906. He wrote Evelyn that evening of how impressed he was, not from the unfinished streets, of which we saw several, but from people and the look of things in general and the way things are done. The place is a cosmopolitan center. He stayed in Seattle a week, writing his mother, "I think Seattle is the place for us. There is much building. I think I can have my share after a little while." Upon his return to Burlington, he wrote again to his mother about Seattle and how pleased Evelyn was with the prospect of moving. He wrote of the fine new architecture he had seen and the city's progressive spirit. Quote, "It is one of about a dozen cities in the country which has adopted a definite plan for its future growth, providing ahead for its park system, street extensions, permanent grades, and the like, and has had a scheme developed by such a firm as Olmsted. That fact would indicate that the place is not lacking in artistic appreciation. Seattle is more Eastern in its general habits and appearance than the towns of the Middle West. The expected Western crudity is missing to a surprising extent. I mean the crudity due to lack of culture. There is, of course, the crudity of newness." The decision made, 1907 was spent completing his projects in Burlington. In August, Walter and Evelyn sailed for London to visit Arthur, his wife Amy, and their 2 sons. After 3 weeks in London, they traveled to Italy and then Paris before returning to New York in late November and holidays with friends and family. Walter and Evelyn arrived in Seattle, their new home, on February 5, 1908. He was 38 years old and essentially starting over. Walter and Evelyn, along with Eva's sister Edna, settled into an apartment on Seattle's Capitol Hill, while Walter and his partner, architect William Sayward, rented office space in the Arcade Annex. Sayward had worked for Walter during the summer of 1899 after graduating from the University of Vermont and before studying architecture at MIT. He then worked for McKim, White in New York. The two quickly set out meeting potential clients and business people, and 1 month after arriving, had a very flattering profile published in the local trade journal, Pacific Builder and Engineer. Walter loved Seattle, writing his mother, quote, "There are fewer restrictions here than in the East. People employing an architect expect he understands his business, and they leave it to him. There is none of that nagging that one was accustomed to in New England." One of their first commissions in May 1908 was a residence for Charles S. Wiley, real estate investor, manager of Title Trust Company, and president of Lewis and Wiley Construction Company. Located on the shore of Lake Washington, the commission included stables, garages, and landscape design, and had a reported construction cost of $50,000, a considerable amount at the time. Later that year, they designed the Bonito Apartments, and in 1909, the Furman Roast Beef Corporation Casino for the AYP, a pentagonal structure that Pacific Builder and Engineer lauded for its appropriately festive character. But the economy was again poor, and work was not enough to keep the 2 partners busy. Walter's mother, now widowed, wrote Arthur that the hard times seem to continue for Walter, and it is depressing. He has not been able to send me any money for a year. He feels badly about it. The business in his line has not picked up as he had hoped, and his expenses have been heavy. He writes cheerfully and hopefully, and says just as soon as possible he will send some money to me. Walter became ever more involved in architectural organizations. He was elected treasurer of the Architectural League of the Pacific Coast and secretary of the Washington chapter of the AIA. He was on the advisory board for YMCA education, and in early 1910 joined an AIA committee advocating formation of a planning commission. Seattle formed the Municipal Plans Commission that spring, and at the end of May 1910, Walter was appointed by Mayor Hiram Gill to be one of 23 members, and its only architect. It was also in 1910 that Walter designed his first structure for the city of Seattle, a viaduct to cross the roadway through the Washington Park Arboretum. More than a decorative bridge, the structure was built to carry a large sewer pipe at a precise elevation from one side of the ravine to the other. For Walter, however, it was much more, for it was an opportunity to beautify the city. Ignoring fashions of the time, he turned not to classical architecture, but sought inspiration in forms of Roman aqueducts and in the materials with which he worked, concrete and brick, using them to create surface patterns that still delight today. City engineers must have been happy with Walter's viaduct design, for soon they asked him to design, or rather redesign, a new water tower for Beacon Hill. Engineering staff had already designed a tower to provide adequate water pressure for South Park, but those in charge were apparently unhappy with the design. In May 1911, it had been turned over to Walter. He wrote his brother Arthur, "The thing of chief interest just now in the office is a water tower for the city. It is to stand on the highest hill of the city, visible from all around and from the bay. It arises 200 feet from its base to peak, and will be built of brick and terracotta. The open story at the top is an observatory, and the gargoyles are not faked ornamentation, but will do their job of the prototypes and discharge rainwater 6 feet or so from the face of the building. The photograph enclosed is of a plaster cast from a wax model, which is some of my own crude handiwork." Despite repeated appropriations for its construction, the tower was never erected, as the reservoirs on Beacon Hill were found to provide adequate pressure. What a loss for the city that was. The majority of Willcox and Sayward's projects after 1910 were houses, which they designed in a wide variety of styles. Although many historians have credited Sayward with the design of houses like that for Leroy Lewis, citing his time spent working for McKim, Mead and White, Walter's letters call for a more nuanced interpretation. As we've seen, Walter was interested in the artistic side of the profession, where Sayward, with a degree in mechanical engineering, was more inclined toward the technical. In 1908, Mother Sarah wrote Arthur, "I had a letter from Walter this morning. A Mr. Cutler, a friend of Walter's, is to build a large apartment house and has asked Walter to draw sketches for it. Walter says, 'We were glad to take on the study of such a problem, as it will require a study of the building ordinance, quite a new problem for us. Sayward and I have decided that each shall draw a plan and then decide whose plan will be submitted.'" In another letter of July 1908, Sarah wrote Arthur that, quote, "Walter finds his association with Mr. Sayward very pleasant and useful. Mr. Sayward is interested in some parts of the work which Walter does not so much enjoy, and so they get along beautifully." So while it appears both partners participated in design, they also divided the work, with Walter leaning more to the artistic side, leaving Sayward to handle the business and technical aspects. In the spring of 1910, Walter wrote his mother that, quote, "Building seemed almost at a standstill this past year," but that allowed him to spend more and more time on the Municipal Plans Commission, leaving Sayward to shoulder an increasing share of the firm's work. Having watched the city continue to grow, Walter strongly believed it needed a more comprehensive plan to complement the Olmsted firm's work on parks and boulevards. Over the next year and a half, Walter played an active role in shaping the municipal plan and made more than a dozen presentations to civic, neighborhood, and business groups on the plan's development and his benefits. He designed a monument for Duwamish Head in Alki, pictured here in the center, which he described to Arthur as just an ideal creation and a hurried one at that. He also contributed to writing the Plan of Seattle, telling Arthur in late 1911, shortly after it was published, "For your own interest, not because the writing, in my opinion, is worth special mention, I will tell you that the introduction I wrote first, but later it was so cut by Mr. Bogue for the need of greater brevity that it is the work of neither Mr. Bogue nor myself. The chapter of Civic Center is my own production, as well as that on playgrounds, the height of buildings, and street intersections. Walter was particularly excited by the proposed Civic Center, for which his friend David Myers prepared a perspective rendering, feeling that it was both functional and artistically inspiring. Walter's disappointment must have been enormous then when voters rejected the Bogue Plan in March 1912, disappointment compounded by increasingly dire economic conditions. Lacking work, William Seward left Seattle, first for Montreal and then Atlanta, where he remained the rest of his life. Walter's financial situation was poor. "My bank account is now $18, he wrote Arthur, but I'm owed $2,000. Yet he remained optimistic. Mother Sarah wrote Arthur that Walter, quote, has hardly been able to meet his expenses, but he is not discouraged. He thinks they will see better days. It is in this context that Walter became a design consultant to the city on the Queen Anne walls. The history of the boulevard is long, and I won't go into it here. But by July 1911, when the Seattle Engineering Department made this drawing, work on the walls had progressed far. The overall layout was established, technical engineering had been completed, and the department was putting finishing touches on the design. Here we see the Lee Street stairs, but it is rather different than we know it today. Not only is the configuration different, there is only one stair down from the boulevard to the landing, but the railings are neoclassical with turned round concrete balusters. Panels inset into the face of the retaining walls are also very different, with arched tops, a division into thirds, and classically shaped corbels supporting the sidewalk above. Another undated set of drawings shows a completely different design alternative. Here the railing is made of concrete piers with inset cast iron panels consisting of a series of circles. The wall below is relieved by panels with semicircular tops, outlined and divided into thirds by brick, infilled by rusticated concrete above a brick base. Adorning it all are a series of cast concrete swags and garlands. Undated drawings at the Seattle Municipal Archives show the engineering department trying out a number of different design schemes, 4 by my count. Among the most interesting is the drawing on the right of the Lee Street stairs. Made predominantly of ink on linen, there is also an added swag in pencil at the top, as if someone was asking, well, should we add more ornament? The chronology of these designs is also interesting. The first drawing I showed you was dated July 1911. That fall, in November 1911, city engineer Reginald H. Thompson, he of regrade fame, was ousted from his position. Promoted to replace him in July 1912 was assistant engineer Arthur Dimmick, with whom Walter had worked on the Beacon Hill Water Tower. On May 6, 1912, most of the sheets were marked void, retraced, or changed. You can see that in the corner of the drawing in the lower left. And that is where we believe Walter entered the picture. Likely pleased with Walter's work on the water tower and Arboretum Viaduct, which was nearing the end of construction, the city turned to him for help with the walls, stairs, and light posts. There are no records that he was ever a city employee, and no records have been located of design fees paid to him. In fact, redesign of the Queen Anne walls appears to have been so free of controversy that Walter's name has not been found in city records, meeting minutes of the Board of Public Works, or contemporary newspaper articles about the project. But by April 1913, when this engineering drawing was completed, Walter had completely revised the design to what we know today. The Lee Street stair now has 2 stairways down to a broad platform overlooking the Sound. Walls now have their distinctive pattern of herringbone brick, and the vertical piers that had been swagged and swagged again now have only a simple ladder-like pattern of inlaid brick. The corbels supporting the sidewalk have been reshaped, and the concrete railing above has a simple pattern of openings accented with brick. During the time Walter was consulting with the city on the Queen Anne walls, he was also serving as president of the Washington AIA. And his president's speech at the end of 1912 provides great insight into his philosophy of design. Challenging his fellow architects to look and move beyond classical precedent, he said, "Probably no single country can show so many varieties of architectural design as America. If we look for a distinctive type, a style of building which may without question be recognized as American, we are likely to find it in structures with which the educated architect has had little or nothing to do, crude structures void of any idea of or attempt at scholarly design. When we examine the field occupied by the skilled architect, we find that any native or national tendencies seem to have been ignored in favor of a frank acceptance of some historical type as a model. It is that attitude toward precedents which acts as an obstruction to the realization of our ideals. The architecture of the past should serve us as a lamp to guide our steps into the future, and not as a blazed trail over which we return unto the past. This is not to be interpreted as a call of the wild, but rather as a plea for freedom from intellectual bondage, the effect of which is to restrict the activities and to lessen the influence of the architect. Let us, to that end, attune our hearts to those wonderful harmonies which are infinite and eternal, and which range far beyond our intellectual ken." In the Queen Anne walls, Walter provided in brick and concrete an example of which he spoke. Free of overt classical detailing, yet not completely ignorant of historical precedent, he turned to the infinite and eternal harmonies of material and pattern, of line, proportion, and texture, of light and shadow. He also demonstrated in the design his belief in civic beauty, in urban infrastructure that was utilitarian and economical, but still inspiring. And he created a design that was accessible to all. It did not require education or knowledge of classical architecture. A design of delight and beauty from near and from far, from below looking up, from inside the stairs, climbing ever highward, and from along the boulevard above. Now working alone or with the help of a single draftsman, Walter's work largely focused on houses. With rent escalating and work scarce, Walter and Evelyn moved in early 1912 from their apartment to a small house on the rural northeast corner of Mercer Island. Sarah wrote Arthur that February that Walter goes back and forth to town on the steamer, which touches at the island several times a day. The house is quite small, but very cozy and will be delightful in summer. They are hoping that business will revive this spring. I sure hope so, for Walter has had little business for the year past. Walter continued his work with the Chamber of Commerce, the Architectural League, and the local AIA. In December of 1913, members of the National AIA elected him as director. He wrote to Arthur, "Of course it sounds pretty big to get that sort of recognition from the profession in America. But really, it is more of a stroke of luck than anything else. There are other men as well qualified or better qualified, but chance brought it my way. When it appeared that I would be nominated, I confess my chief wish was to be elected so that I could go and see Mother. I suppose I shall take the trip east once or twice a year for the next 3 years." He continued to write in his letters about independence in architectural design, and he saw essays published locally, nationally, and even in the Journal of the Royal Institute of British Architects. And as he followed the region's economic woes, as he watched inequality in wealth and income grow, and as he watched some get rich on land speculation while others were homeless, he became ever more involved in politics. He wrote Arthur, "I am, I suppose, a pronounced radical. My friends call me a socialist in jest, but I am nearer that than to a conservative." He continued, "The conservatives are a hindrance to the development of the race and the countries where they are in control. The radicals may cause disturbances. I suppose their actions must do so. But I am ready to suffer my share of the distress in order that the next generation and the next and the next may have a life of less worry and disappointment than the mass of mankind experience today." In November 1914, Walter spoke at the opening of the University of Oregon School of Architecture, headed by his longtime friend Ellis Lawrence, and he again called on architects and architectural students to unshackle themselves from classical precedent. In December, he visited his mother after attending the AIA convention in Washington. She wrote Arthur that Walter, quote, is looking well, but was rather tired. I wonder that he keeps so cheerful, for he says that he has just managed to keep his head above water for several years, although he has been very, very busy on civil service, helping on several committees for the betterment of the city, and helping a class of young men in his business. These things he has enjoyed, but they have not been very profitable to him. I think he has a real desire to be helpful to humanity. At times, Walter collaborated with other architects, such as in design of the Leamington Hotel and Apartments, and during World War I, he worked with A. H. Albertson at the Bureau of Housing to design 250 houses, a hotel, and an apartment for the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton. He followed the work closely, ever concerned for the safety of Arthur and his family in London, and his letters grew long, often 5 or 6 single-space type pages, filled with strident opinions on politics and society. The end of the war brought an uptick in business. When I returned to take up my own work, he wrote his siblings, I found it much like beginning business all over again. Months passed, it seemed, without prospect of ever getting anything to do again. But gradually work came in, and today I am as busy as I can well be by myself. But he also continued to be consumed with politics. In April 1919, he wrote that since the end of the war, quote, calling names takes the place of intelligent discussion, especially among the supposedly respectable. You know, we had what is called a general strike here, and if I can see and hear straight, the striking work people were the sweet-tempered ones. It was from college graduates and businessmen that I heard curses called down upon the working population. By the summer of 1920, he seemed resigned to his immediate conditions. That spring, he wrote a long letter describing life on Mercer Island and how content they were living surrounded by nature, but also with chickens and a small vegetable garden. He continued, I am working on a couple of store alterations, a Japanese Baptist church, a little garden, and have just finished drawing for a cemetery monument. He also continued to design houses, such as this one for the developer of the Leamington Hotel. But lacking the same optimism as in previous years, he told his siblings, I am going through the motions of practicing architecture, but such work as comes to hand is hardly of the sort to dignify by that name. By the spring of 1921, Walter's published writings and work with the AIA had brought him national recognition. In April, he was asked to join James Gamble Rogers and Henry Bacon, both well-known Eastern architects, as a juror for the Kansas City Liberty Memorial Competition. The following year, he joined Bernard Maybeck and his friend Ellis Lawrence as juror for the Waikiki War Memorial Competition. And it was in that spring of 1922 that Walter was invited by Ellis Lawrence to head the Department of Architecture at the University of Oregon. At the end of May, Walter wrote his siblings, just a brief message to say, I have experienced that supposedly impossible event, that in which lightning strikes twice at the same place. He was delighted by his appointment to the Waikiki journey and the invitation to join the faculty of Oregon, about which he wrote, I had supposed that we were fixtures here for life, but evidently one can never tell. The idea was far from my mind of making another move. I am told I should feel flattered that the job in Oregon is a great compliment, and I grant it has that appearance, but I am chiefly concerned with the prospects of handling such a task to the benefit of the university, and especially the students. It all seems so very funny. After 14 years in Seattle, Walter and Evelyn moved to Eugene at the end of September 1922. He was 53 years old and embarking on the third phase of his career. In Eugene, Walter served on the Planning Commission, a continuation of his interest that had blossomed in Seattle more than a decade earlier. And he opened a small office and designed several buildings, but within a few years he quit active practice to devote time to teaching and writing. As the 1920s ended, the economy tanked, and the Great Depression overcame America, Walter's interest in economic matters took an increasing amount of his time and attention. Shortly after moving to Eugene, he wrote his siblings, "Just don't concede that I am a socialist. I think I have cautioned you before, but I want to repeat it. I want freedom of people, freedom to make use of the earth's resources, and doing away with the system which believes in their preemption by the few. I want men to pay for the privilege of using the earth's resources, to pay back all the people the value of such privileges. Then let individual men produce what they can by their industry and skill. Let them have what they produce, but let them live by working, not by owning. We might find a Christian world possible then. I can see no chance of one otherwise." Walter was an ardent follower of American political economist Henry George, who believed that the economic interest of land should belong to all members of society, and that a single tax on land values would create a more productive and just society. He began to speak nationally on economic matters, and in 1932, Walter chaired an AIA committee on taxation. He was immensely proud of the committee's multi-page reports, sending them to his siblings, but he conceded, "It is a small pebble tossed into the pond of profound ignorance of what is taking place in the world today." In 1938, Walter privately printed the book Taxation Turmoil, that was later revised and republished as The Curse of Modern Taxation. After reading it, Walter's brother Frank wrote Arthur with more than a little exasperation, "Walter advocates doing away with land ownership in toto and immediately. Well, that is his right in a free country. The thing that mildly distresses me is the evidence of near fanaticism in the effect his main idea has on all of his thinking. He shows a growing superciliousness towards those who differ with him on any subject, economic, political, educational, or international." Rarely, if ever, did Frank or Arthur respond directly to the political and economic views expressed in Walter's long letters. While his economic views gained little traction, Walter's teaching at the School of Architecture was immensely well received and had long-lasting and widespread effect. Working with Ellis Lawrence, who had recently begun to move the school away from the Beaux-Arts system, Walter did away with competitions, awards, and letter grades. He wrote his brothers and sister in 1924, quote, "I have a large family of temperamental children who take about all my time and quite my daily quota of strength." He felt that every student was different and wrote, "We have made such changes as are calculated to keep them interested. We have discarded classwork as such, and now every student in the place is engaged upon an individual problem. I'm speaking here of design, without regard to the problems of others. We are about to embark upon the logical sequence, that each student may proceed as fast as he chooses and shows himself fit." Walter encouraged his students to move away from thinking of architecture in terms of style or fashion. Fresh and abiding interest, he wrote in 1928, may appear in buildings when design flows freely and frankly from logical possibilities of materials, practicalities of construction, utilities of plan, and the inspiration contained in the idea to be expressed. These indeed are the fundamentals which determine the final aesthetic status of any structure. His reform of the school brought national attention, and his abandonment of design competitions and from the teaching of classical styles of architecture were emulated widely. His educational reform was praised by none other than Frank Lloyd Wright, who said while on a 1931 West Coast tour organized by Walter that Oregon was the best architectural school in the nation. After 18 years, Walter retired from active teaching in 1940, but he remained involved in the school and continued to host informal weekly gatherings in his home for students, faculty, and guests. Walter's teaching and devotion to his students engendered fierce loyalty. As his health declined following Evelyn's death in 1942, a loyal group continued to look after him. Walter Willcox passed away on April 20, 1947. In the following days, Harlow Hudson, one of his caregivers, wrote Frank, "Walter's personal integrity to his great ideals drew people from all walks of life to him. They seemed not to serve the man, but the truth. Only the genuine could stand in the brilliance of that light. His doctor expressed it when he said, "I didn't know a college professor could attract people as he did." Who was Walter Willcox, the man behind the walls? First and foremost, I believe he was a humanist. He passionately believed in people and sought to bring out their best. He believed in fairness, writing and speaking often on equality. He believed that cities should be planned and guided by goals and ideals that were practical, functional, but also artistic. He believed that architecture should be of its time and should inspire not by its recollection of past eras or styles, but through qualities of mass, proportion, line, and material. He was a very good designer who believed that simplicity and utility could be beautiful. And that is why, more than 100 years later, we still appreciate and admire the Willcox walls. Thank you. Thank you all for joining, and thank you especially to Norman Willcox for sharing these letters.